Good morning, everyone. I want to first welcome all of you. I'm Samantha Bosshart, the Executive Director of the Saratoga Springs Preservation Foundation, and I have to say, it's just really nice to see people in person. Yes. So I'm happy that all of you were willing to come out and be a part of this event. Maria, over there, over there. So let's, we'll get started. I want to say that for those of you who may not be familiar with the Saratoga Springs Preservation Foundation, it was established in 1977. Its mission is to preserve and enhance the architectural and cultural landscape heritage of Saratoga Springs. We do that through educational programs such as this. Advocacy, you may have seen us recently advocating to preserve the two long vacant, intentionally neglect buildings on Philo Street. We have a small victory at the moment that the buildings were not approved to be demolished, but you know, it's just one step in the process. But we are optimistic that there is a future for both of those buildings and that they will be soon out of the current owner's hands. So to those of you who are members and who support us that way, thank you. That goes to that point that if you're not a member, I would encourage you to join. We are a membership-based organization, and membership is important to how we are able to do what we do. In addition to, I got off track with the whole 65 and 69 file. I wasn't expecting like claps. We also do restoration projects. Relatively recent is the Spirit of Life in Congress Park that we completed in 2015. That was a large undertaking in partnership with the city, but we just this past year, we had organized volunteers to contribute 150 hours to help maintain that landscape there. And we will be doing more of that this month and throughout the summer. In fact, we have a volunteer day getting organized for May 18th. So if anybody likes to garden, that is not my skill set, but I will gladly welcome you there. But I could probably weed, I guess. I probably could handle that if somebody directed me to what a weed was. But anyway, and then we also recently helped the First Baptist Church restore some of their most at-risk stained glass windows. So those are just some of the things that we do. We also provide technical assistance to building owners. So people that want to go through the process of making changes to their historic buildings or need advice about how to approach a project. So those are all the different things that we do. So like I said, if you're not already a member, I hope that you'll consider being a member to help support our mission. I also want to, again, promote the virtual Historic Homes Tour. We had it professionally produced, and it highlights all the homes that you see on the flyer at your table. It's pretty cool. It has a lot of overhead drone footage, which is pretty neat to see Saratoga from that perspective. It highlights the history and architecture of those buildings. That will be available through Sunday night at midnight, and you can purchase tickets online, or I'm sure Nicole, while she's doing other things, will be happy to take your money. I want to give a big thank you to Joe Boken for sharing his space and hosting us. And the enthusiastic Boken family who is here. I want to also thank Little Market at 5 Points for providing today's food. And just a few other items for those before we get started. Please silence your phones. Please wear your mask when you're standing. If you are joining us by Zoom, please be sure to, we are doing this also via Zoom for those that weren't comfortable coming to an in-person event just yet. So please mute yourself, Zoom people. If you have a question in Zoom, feel free to put it in the chat and Nicole will help to catch that. And because we have people in Zoom, I would really appreciate that we you keep your talking amongst yourselves to basically non-existent, because we don't want that extra noise in the background. Lastly, I am always thrilled to have Carol Godette. She does great, she tells great stories and history and presentations. So I'm very honored that she's our first one back in person, because she did some great presentations for us in the fall, Hidden Histories. And I believe those are those both online still? Yes, so if you missed her presentations from the fall about her hidden histories, you can check those out still on our website. She was born and raised in Saratoga Springs. Carol and her husband Dave live in her Nelson Avenue childhood home, where they raised their 2 children. She taught 5th grade for 31 years at both Greenfield Elementary and Lake Avenue School. And she is co-owner of the local Ben & Jerry's franchise, which we of course love, and who doesn't love ice cream. And for the past 4 years, it may be 5 years now, that she's been writing for Simply Saratoga magazine, which is where I also contribute an article. So I think the combination of the 2 of us is great to help get people more aware of our history, because I think we have a lot of people who come to Saratoga that are new and don't really realize all the history that came before and what the effort that goes into making sure we preserve our past. Preservation doesn't just happen. It just doesn't magically happen. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Carol. So thank you so much. Oh, I was supposed to say one more thing. Carol, because she's been a school teacher for all those years, she likes to walk around the room. She's going to struggle for the people on Zoom to stay in one place, but we're gonna take care of that. And well, she's gonna try her best to stay in place. So, all right, well, thank you.
Thank you. And I'd like to thank Nicole and Samantha for all the support they've given me in getting this presentation together. And I'd also like to, again, shout out to the 5 Points, the little market at 5 Points, because I started my whole venture with this because I was fascinated with neighborhood stores. And 5 Points is the only surviving neighborhood store from originally. And there's kind of a connection with this place in 5 Points. So when I started doing my research on neighborhood stores, I talked to Ann Boken, who owned this place. And she used to go to 5 Points. She said, you know, it was the closest market. And we'll talk about what Saratoga looked like then when she first took it over. And Rod Sutton, some of you know his son, Rod Sutton had it at the time, and he would deliver groceries to me. So Ann went to 5 Points, and now here we are 50 years later, and 5 Points is coming to us. So that's kind of full circle. As Samantha said, I've written for Simply Saratoga, and for the past year and a half, I kind of changed the focus of my article, and I started a series called On This Spot, where I take a location and kind of peel back the layers to say, what was here? Okay, this is what we think it is now, but what was here before, and before that, and go back as far as I can. So each place I've done this hidden history has always been fascinating, and this one did not disappoint me. This spot has such rich history, and I came up with some startling revelations. So my goal today, and planted throughout, thanks to Joey, and I don't know where Joey is disappeared to. Joey has brought in people to just round out this presentation, and I don't want to spoil who they are. So as we kind of go along, we'll unfold some of them. But Ann Boken, as you see in this picture, had 6 children. Joey was her youngest, and 5. Not true. See, already I have experts here.
You forgot about number 6. It was a girl.
Oh, a girl. He was the only boy. Okay, so there are 5 girls, and we have 2 of them with us today. If they could stand up, Susan and Patrice. And so they were raised here. So they are going to be my experts when we get to some of that part of the story. I will tell you that. So there's my clicker. My clicker. To the computer. Okay. It worked when she had it this morning. Yeah, technology, our best friend and our worst nightmare. I may have to just do this manually. Okay. Well, let's see. Let's see.
The blind person.
Well, I'm going to tell you, there were many misconceptions about the Washington Inn. And one of them, when Joey took it over, he renamed it Ann's Washington Inn. It had always been called the Washington Inn. And people would see the name Ann and they'd say, oh, you named it after George Washington's wife. And Joey would kind of laugh and said, no, her name was Martha. And we also were about 100 years off. So Joey had this little plaque. If we ever get the next slide to come up, he would have out that would say, this is George Washington did not sleep here. Okay, so I want you to then think in your head, why do you think it's called the Washington Inn if it wasn't for George Washington? Anybody have any guesses? Susan, you know the answer. I'm not going to call it. Anyone else? Okay, Washington Street, good guess. Okay.
Oh, I think.
All right. Okay. So George Washington did not sleep here. Dan.
Don't worry, guys.
I'm sorry. The Washington Spas. Excellent. Okay. It's named for the Washington Baths, which were right nearby. And after the presentation, I want you to go outside and walk the grounds, and we'll talk a little bit more about why we want to do that. I guess we have a low battery problem.
Yes, we're just having.
So there were many,
first in person / Zoom. I mean, come on, what could go wrong?
Charlie, you can work it all out here.
yeah, I'll keep. So at one time, Patrice was an aide in my classroom. And so she's used to stepping in for me and just kind of
I
going.
learned more working in your class about electricity than I could have. The circuit board. It was great.
This one.
Okay. So when Joey took it over in 1985, he found out there were a lot of misconceptions. People said, what's, it's a blind driveway. It's up on a hill, kind of tucked away. There's a stone wall around the property. And people would say, what goes on up there? And did you say, people would say, is that a mob hideout? Yes. I had heard that it was a home for unwed mothers. So I think there were a lot of rumors out there. So we're first activity. So this is a game I always play with my granddaughter. She lives in London, and we do a lot of FaceTiming, and we play 3 truths and a lie a lot. So you're going to be playing for prizes today. So on your little form, I have 3 truths and 1 lie about this place. And I want you to guess which one is the lie. And then we're going to collect them, and there'll be a drawing at the
I
end.
believe I put enough around, but if somebody doesn't.
Okay, so for you people playing at home, the Zoom people, you're going to just type it in your chat box. So A, this is a site of life's big events, births, weddings, and deaths. And they always say you got to have an easy one in there. So, okay, B, this location was the origins of Temple Sinai. C, the Boken family enjoys mineral waters from a private tapped spring. And D, the original address was at the Avenue of Pines. So think about it, and Samantha will be around to collect your answers, and we'll reveal that in a little bit. So in this picture, you could see Joey hosted this open house so people could really see what was up this hill. Okay.
This arrow.
Okay. Okay.
It's just.
All right. So in order to understand this spot, we're going to have to go back in history. Horn wrote a great article that I came across. I have it up here, and I could definitely get you copies if you're interested in seeing it. and reading them more in detail about it. But think back to Saratoga in the mid 1800s. Basically, Gideon Putnam has laid it out. We've got Broadway. At the north end of Broadway, you may have heard of Woodlawn Estate, where Skidmore College is. There's a large estate. At the south end, this whole area, and you've got to realize as you look out, none of these structures were here, was an estate that was 150 acres large, and it was called Woodlea. It was owned by a very colorful character, a very rich man named John Beekman. He was from New York City. He was involved in the theater. He never married, and he built a stone mansion, and it was over where the Price Chopper is today on Bolster Avenue. How many of you remember the mansions when you were growing up? So that's about all that was here. This mansion and this large property. In this map, you can kind of see it's starting to be divided up. After he died, his nephew, John Beekman Finlay, took over the property and he lived in this mansion. I have another fascinating article up here. It's really long, but it was from the New York Times. It was written in 1874. And he was saying that this mansion, which had no longer been lived in by John Beekman because he's dead, had an air, it should be taken down, and it had an air of being haunted. But after he dies and his nephew lives there, his nephew has 12 children. The oldest of these children's name is Aletta. Have you ever heard of Aletta? Aletta Street. Okay. Her name is Aletta Finlay. She was a colorful character. And Field highlights her in this article. She became friends with a doctor in town named Dr. Perry, and it was not uncommon at that time for doctors to take opium. It was readily available, and he became an opium addict. According to these articles, I don't like to spread rumors, but drug rumors, but they became close. He was married. Eventually, Aletta and he run off together to Vermont and they get married. She gives half of this property to the Perry family, and they end up selling this property a little bit later, and it's divided up into, into lots. And you can see in 1873, all these lots. Now, we recognize them today as spa circles, all those, but those weren't developed until the 50s and 60s. So they were divided into lots, but they sat vacant most of the time. Still, the only thing that's here is the mansion. And then they start promoting it. They start promoting it in an ad in the New York Times. Woodlea, homes for all at liberal and low prices, liberal terms. So people from New York, so again, we're putting in context of what's happening at the time. And this article in the New York Times talks about Saratoga and how popular it's becoming in 1874. It's saying that there's more activity, and it's so full circle to what's happening right now. There's even more activity at this time than there was 12 months ago. And here, land is going at $200 per square foot that is being asked and readily attained. So at this time, these cottages, which the article says are really mansions, are being built along North Broadway, and they're going for dear prices. So there was a couple who were well-to-do from New York, and they thought, we'd like to have one of those cottages for ourselves, but they decide to instead buy up these 11 lots. So if you can see on this map, they're circled in green, lots 405 going to 399 across, and that is this property. It's the only property in Woodlea that is developed for a long time. So we're wondering about exactly, the Thompsons buy it. So we're wondering, when exactly was this purchased, or excuse me, erected? We have somebody here to tell us about that in just a second. We know that John Thompson dies. His obituary is in the New York Times in 1886. And he dies actually at this residence. So the cottage is, and I couldn't find exactly the name, it's either called Sunnyside or Sunset Villa. So Joey, tell us, you were telling me about what you heard at this time, why it was named that. As they sat on the porch, you said they would look out.
You could look out and you could see Saratoga Lake from our porch because everything was clear cut.
And so there they could sit and they could look at the lake and see the sun. Kind of amazing. What was really unusual, and so my neighbor Mitch, who's watching this on Zoom because he's away, helped me with this part of the research a little bit. What was really unusual is that in the deeds, it's in his wife's name. This is not a time when women owned property. So it seemed very unusual. From what, and Mitch is really a super sleuth. I said, we gotta find this out. He started looking and he found the court case after John Thompson dies. Obviously there was considerable wealth there, and the nieces and nephews challenged the will and tried to get their portion of the will. And it was even in the will that if Jenny remarried, she got nothing. So she owned the property. She lived till 1912, but she ended up selling it and just continued to have a life in New York City and did not come here after that. So she sold it in 1900. So here's what it became. So here's our next surprise in the audience. So how many of you know what this is? Any of you? Oh, we do. Come on, surprise. So it became a hospital, Mccarty Hospital. So before we get to our surprises, the man who opened Mccarty Hospital, again, let's step back. So believe it or not, in 1895, in 1893, actually, there is no hospital in Saratoga. A doctor came from Schuylerville. His name was Dr. Richard Mccarty. And where he set up practice, and if you can read this article, he treated patients. If something went wrong, you went to the back room of the police department and you were treated. So he treated patients in the back room of the police department. And at the bottom of this article, it said that he served there. He retired from this spot when he was hit on the right cheek by a brick as he was treating a brawl victim for knife slashes. So he was probably very motivated to have a hospital where he could treat people. But also, in the Saratogian does an anniversary edition of the newspaper in 1905. And here's a copy of it, again, looking at this. And it highlighted the hospital. So in 1905, which is actually when he opens the door to this hospital, there are two hospitals. There's the Comstock Hospital, which is on the corner of Phyla and Regent Street. And it's later called the Cure, and it lasts till about 1923, but it's kind of a private hospital. From anything I read, it sounded expensive. I'm not sure if that's true, but that's the sense I got. And then the Saratoga Hospital, which is not where we think of it today. The original Saratoga Hospital, anybody know where it was?
I do. Who, me?
Yes.
Yeah, it's East Harrison Street and Division Street, right there from the hotel.
Yes, East Harrison and Division Street. So there's the original hospital. But the Mccarty Hospital was unusual for many reasons. And one of the things, I like to think a place has synergy. And I think this place has synergy in the fact that it's a place that's warm, welcoming, and is a place for civic-minded people. And the Mccartys were very civic-minded. You can't see what that sign said, but it says free to the poor on Tuesdays and Thursdays. So they gave out free care. So we have somebody here who was actually born upstairs at this hospital. And she's seated right there, Kathy DeVivo. And she was telling me this morning, and this was fascinating. She said, when I was born, there was no money exchanged for my birth. Okay, Kathy, do you want to say, or do you want me to say?
I would. My mother was in here for 2 weeks. And my grandfather was a lumberman, and he paved with 4 cords of wood.
Okay. So for you, if you couldn't hear that, I'm just going to repeat that her father was a lumberman and he paid for her birth with 4 cords of wood.
Is that a lot of wood?
Yes.
She was in for 2 weeks.
Yes. Back then you did stay longer for a birth. So I don't think money was Richard Mccarty's primary driving force in running this operation. Several interesting things about him. We also have one of his relatives sitting back there. And this is Dan Mccarty. And he, Richard was your great-great-grandfather's brother?
Correct.
Yes. Okay.
Yep, great-great-grandfather John Thomas and Richard were brothers. In fact, Richard was 7 and John was 6.
So Richard had a large family. He and his wife, Ann, had 8 children. They had 5 girls and 3 boys. So this was not a large enough property for them. So they built behind you this, what you call the annex or the south building. So if you turn out there, there's this other building, and that's where they lived. And up here we have the blueprints for that property, and they are dated 1906. So that building was in 1906 built to house the family because they also had needed a lot of room, and we had a lot of people being treated here. Another interesting thing, another plant. So Joey was so great in bringing in all these people for me. We have back there is Lenny Muller. So Lenny, do you want to come up or do you just want to stay there? So Lenny was doing some work and he came across, because it's really hard for us to pinpoint the date of when this building was built. So in his restoration work, he came across a board and he's going to tell us.
Anyhow, a few years back,
Lenny, do you want to just come stand right here so our Zoom people can see you too?
I'm not sure if I want to be seen. Anyway, it's got to be 15 years ago that we're running an air conditioning duct just about where the picture hangs on the other side of that wall. And I cut a couple of boards out in order to run that duct through. And sure enough, they're signed. And it's a Clinton something or other, 1885 and 1885. And these fellas, these carpenters, for whatever reason, they just signed this board. And it came to light when I took the boards down. And I said, man, we got to save that stuff. So we did. And Joey framed it and everything. And it's just part of the history of this building. 1886, those carpenters, hardworking fellas, didn't know a machine tool from Adam. And they're using hand saws, hand drills and everything else. So when you see some of this old equipment, that's what built this building. And those folks that built this town, very, very talented. And I'll mention one other thing. The fellow that had the apple land on his head, Isaac Newton, he had a saying, and I quote, if I can remember.
Read the back of the thing anyhow.
What's in the back?
Read it.
Oh, Lord. 21 June 2004. Found this signatures on the interior wall of the Washington Inn, 111 South Broadway, and I signed it. 119 years ago. Who were these fellows so long departed? Hardworking people. Thank you. And I'll put this back.
Is it pine, Lenny?
Yeah, it's just pine. just pine boards and board and bat, and that's how everything was built. There was no plywood, there was no OSB, there was no nothing. It was natural products.
It lasts forever and should be preserved.
I think.
Well, thank you. What a treat to have. And again, in researching, we couldn't pin down, no one took a photograph of the original structure. So we couldn't pin down exactly the date. So this was fabulous that we were able to find that. Samantha. Okay, so another person who was amazing in preserving our history and our story was George Bolster. So this is from the George Bolster collection. This is a 1931 photograph, and just a little aside is that so many things came out of COVID out of necessity, and one of them is the Bolster collection was all digitized. And if you haven't heard, within 6 months, the entire collection is going to be available for you online. You can look at it, and then if you want to buy a print, so this is just for a digital copy that Jamie Carrillo let me have. You can purchase the print, you can order a higher resolution. So this is 1931, and this is really what I was talking about, setting the scene. This is what it looked like. No Adirondack Trust, you see the danger. And on the other side of that danger sign, and maybe some of you who grew up here, I remember this, was a sign as you were coming into Saratoga that said entering Saratoga. So this is kind of considered the outskirts of town. Also, so you'll know maybe one of the answers to the 3 Truths and a Lie, there is the Avenue of the Pines sign, if you could see it. So the address was really for this was at the Avenue of the Pines. Now we always think of the Avenue of Pines today, the other entrance. But the Avenue of Pines started just outside. So after you're done, you can look, it's still there, the pedestrian path. So when the Avenue of Pines was actually started as a pedestrian path that was a mile long, and it was called the Pine Promenade. And in 1929, a few years before this was photographed, it became paved for automobiles. So originally, when we were starting to do the health spa and coming here for the cure, part of the cure, besides taking mineral waters, was taking long walks. So you would take your mineral waters and then you would promenade on the avenue or the Avenue of the Pines. So after it was paved, it was renamed. How many of you remember driving along the original Avenue of Pines, the entrance? I always loved it because it was just kind of mysterious, and you knew you were going someplace special as you entered it. And you can see this stone wall, and Joey would love to know, and I would love to know, he's asked me several times, and it's just really hazarding a guess. Was this built by the Mccartys? Was this built by the Thompsons? Or was this built as, because it's the southern or the border of Woodlea, was this built as part of the boundary of Woodlea? And I'm not really sure, but it does have the same kind of stone that the mansion had. So I wish I knew the answer to that question. Richard Mccarty was very generous. So when he opened up the hospital, he set up this fund, which $100 was a lot of money at this time. And he put it aside, and it was going to be given to the first woman who gave birth to twins here. Well, that sat there for 30 years. And finally, in 1937, the first twins are born, and he awards that prize. And then gives each of the twins $25. And at that time, that's a lot of money. So this is just another example of how generous he was. And I don't think money was his driving force. You know, he would take things in trade. So his first wife dies, and they go to great efforts to save her. In 1927, she passes away. She has sepsis, and he's giving her blood transfusions from his son. I was reading articles. So of course he has all these children, he's running a hospital. He ends up remarrying one of the nurses in the hospital, and they have 2 more children. So there was, from what I read, a little bit of discussion among the family members over what was going to happen with this property. And this article from the Gazette in 1939 said he didn't pay his taxes. So he probably, again, was very generous, maybe didn't always collect money, you know, was giving services to the poor and just couldn't keep up with them. So for those reasons, it goes up for auction, tax auction. Now, we take a little shift and you're probably wondering, what are we looking at the Hotel Russell for? And some people here know. Well, Ann Boken's maiden name was Russell and she was raised at the Hotel Russell. Her parents owned it. And so her father, Charlie, needed an overflow place for the summers. So he hears of this tax sale and for $28,000, which at that time in 1943 was a lot of money, he buys the Washington Inn with the Mccarty Hospital to change it into the Washington Inn. So he purchases it. And when you think about that time, that's a huge leap of faith. So what's going on in 1943? The war. Okay, there's no racing in Saratoga. There's no racing in 43, 44, or 45 because of gas. If people don't have gas to get here. But yet in this huge leap of faith, and also because his daughter has just had a baby. Samantha, okay. So here we are in 1947, and here's the property just after he's purchased it. And again, you can see from this Bolster collection picture, see how rural it is? This is really the outskirts of town. Anne has just had her firstborn, and she's living in Schenectady because her husband was an engineer there. She had been a secretary at GE, and she wanted help with the baby, and she wanted to come up, have her mom help her. So her father said, well, why don't you take over the Washington Inn? You can live there, operate it in the summer, and have the children live there. So it is so rural. So Patrice told me this story, which I can picture her mother doing. So Patrice.
So two things. One thing.
Do you mind coming up?
No, not
Thanks.
at all. Oh, I
Just
forgot
so our
about
Zoom people, yes.
Oh, this is my fourth time Zooming in a year, so.
You just have to stand here, that's all.
So anyway, two things. My grandfather had business in 1943 because he advertised in Cuba in a Havana newspaper because Cubans were traveling not for the races, but for mineral baths. So grandpa was occupied. And he would say that he'd look out the window, see what kind of car the person was driving and determine the rate of staying overnight. The story my mother told is she's up here in the hotel is a hospital. So it's full of all this creepy equipment and stuff. And my mother's like, dear Lord. But anyway, some man came up the hill and it was Thursday and he was banging on the screen door. My mother's like, what the heck? She has Peggy on her hip. She puts Peggy in a drawer. She comes out with my grandfather's rifle and said to this man, I don't know how to operate this, but probably by the third shot, I'll probably like hit you. And my mother said the man like turned around and like just kind of marched in a straight line down the hill, you know. So my mother was a capable person.
And of course, no one is around. She doesn't have any neighbors here to help her. So it has to be converted from a hospital into an inn. Another thing to think about before we talk about that process is there's a lot of competition at that time. And I hope that you come up here and look at this board closer. We can pass it around. There are 41 hotels. And when I say hotels, we're talking about the Grand Union that had 768 rooms. The United States didn't make it through World War II. It just didn't have enough business and did not open after the war. But there are so many other large hotels and there are 92 boarding houses. So when you look in the city directory, they don't classify things as inns or motels. There's two classifications, boarding houses or hotels. And some of the places they called boarding houses, something like the Beverly, which is the headquarters of Quad Graphics today on North Broadway, were large places. So I put together this display, which maybe Samantha could bring around for you to look at. These postcards are from Beatrice Sweeney's postcard collection, which I was lucky enough to inherit after she passed. And you can see all of the competition. There's a huge amount of competition. So again, your grandfather had a great leap of faith because he has a lot of competition.
If you want to learn more about the Beverly or the former Brackett House, that is part of the virtual tour. So just another little plug.
So here's a picture of Anne and her husband, Joe, when they first opened up. I love this picture. And there's a wonderful, a broadcast, I guess you would call it. Her Life TV did an interview with her a few years back. And she talked about, and she still glows when she talks about her husband. And she talked about when they took this over, there was only one bathroom, but Joe, with his engineer background, was able to work on the blueprints. And of course, now there's a bathroom with every bedroom. So that was a huge undertaking, converting this into a hotel. Joe also told me a story that I could so picture. One of the things, Anne had amazing people skills and she loved people. And so she had this routine. She wanted everyone to think she remembered them and knew them. So Joe, can you share that story? Because you'll do it much better than I.
So when I first started running the hotel,
Sorry. So when Joe first started running the hotel, he's, I'm just filling you in. He's gonna talk about his mother's handy trick she taught him.
So when I first started running the hotel, I'd say to my mother, how do you remember everybody's names? They come once a year, they're here for a couple of days. And she said, oh, she said, when I first started, I bought a Lazy Susan and I put the registration book on it and I would turn it toward them and discuss the weather, what was going on. And then as they're filling it out below it, I've got a list of everyone who was checking in and she'd know the name and boom, she'd have the information and be able to tell the story and know their names. Wow. Her secret.
And also at the same time, she's raising eventually 6 children and they lived here except in the summer. So Susan, do you want to tell us what happened in the summer to you?
So in the winter, we closed in early fall, and in the winter, depending on the pecking order, of course, my older sister getting the first choice, we would live in all of these assorted grand rooms. And when the summer came, my father had dug out the basement and we lived in the warren underneath in the catacombs. And there were so many aspects to that. But when we came back up in the winters, we got older. We had curfews like every one of you had. And my older sister and I dutifully always came home by curfew, and we'd make noise as we came in the house and we'd go to our rooms. And then we'd wait 5 minutes and walk out our private hotel exits. The car was at the top of the hill. We'd roll down the hill without turning it on, and we'd go about our evening plans. So it was an advantage having a hotel with exits everywhere.
While you're up here. So there was another little hidden nugget. So again, I said they were very civic minded and they were very connected and integral in the community. So Susan's father, Joe, was friends with someone. Do you want to tell about his friendship?
Two things strike me that were funny. When we were in, maybe I was 7th or 8th grade, and my dad was great friends with Dr. Jack Fenman. And one day Jack came to my father and he said, I don't know what the dispute was about, but we have had a parting of ways with the one temple in town. And he said, Joe, we're going to leave the temple, many of us, and we want to form a new temple. And we will get a building and we will do everything. But for now, we need a place. So in the front room, we had the beginning of our lovely temple in town, Temple Sharif, and they were here for Sinai, Temple Sinai. Sorry, Temple Sinai. And we would peek in and there would be all of these mysterious things that little Catholic girls had never seen, and the Torahs and all of the different things. But one other little story I hadn't told Carol that I remember so fondly. I was at school in the South in college, and one of the grand Southern fathers invited me out to dinner with a daughter. And he said, "Now, where are you from, my dear?" And I said, "Saratoga Springs." He said, "What? Why, I was born there. And my father was doing business in New York, and my mother gave birth to me in Saratoga." And I said, "I can tell you the address and the room you were born in." And he was amazed. And that was fun.
So Anne did this with style and grace. And she quietly promoted it. So sometimes I think, Patrice, did you have to cover for her in the afternoon? So I first became friends with Anne in 1978. I was teaching and I was going to get married that summer. And every afternoon I went to the Victoria pool to work on my tan so it looked good with the wedding dress. And I sat in the same corner where Anne and her cousin Claire would sneak out every afternoon from 2 to 4. And she would come. I think the rest of the family thought that she was grocery shopping or doing something for it. But Anne knew how to take care of herself with everything going on. And so she would say, "Oh dear, tell me about the wedding." And so as this friendship evolved, she'd say, "Well, you know, you're getting married at the Gideon. Well, you have to have your guests stay at the inn because it's so close." And so thus she was quietly promoting her business. And yes, my guests stayed here. And it was a perfect location.
That was the excuse that she gave us. She was promoting the hotel. We didn't know it was at the Victoria pool.
Oh, okay. Well, that's where she did some of her work. And here's a picture of Anne. And after 50 years in this business, when she turned 70, she said to Joey and his wife, Kathy, "You know, let's go out for breakfast. I need to talk to you about something." And she decided at that point it'd been enough and she wanted to turn it over the operations to them. And in just this marketing genius, Joey takes it over and he said, "You know what? I'm going to do a little rebranding." Was that a word then? Yes. No, it wasn't. So he did the original rebranding and he renamed it Anne's Washington Inn. Now, why do you think that was so brilliant?
Because it comes up first in the phone book.
That's right. All of a sudden, it had always been at the bottom of the list, and now it's at the top of the list. So that was just brilliant, Joey. And look, the internet. The internet.
Chamber of Commerce, you know, by the park.
Yes, at the listing. So I love that. Plus, I think it gives a person, it makes it more real. And another thing, a story I love about Anne is she lived in Prestwick Chase at that time. And when she knew her days were numbered and she decided this was it, she was getting blood transfusions, she didn't want to get any more. She said to the family, "You know what, I want to come back to the Washington Inn and spend my last few days here." And so she did. She moved into that front room and everyone that she knew in her life was invited to come and say goodbye to her. And I did that. And it was just a wonderful memory for me. And she did it with a smile. You know, we had our last few words together and she smiled and said, "This is it. And I'm okay with this." And she taught me, you know, how to go out with grace and style. And that's the type of woman that she was. So Joey takes over. And here's a picture of his mascot. And this is a story unto itself. And I know we're kind of running a little short on time, but this is a very integral part of Joe's operation. So maybe when you came in, you saw this car parked outside. How many of you saw it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Anybody know what it is? I know we have some people here who are experts on this. It's a 1927 Buick. So Joey, do you want to tell us a little bit about why you chose this for your mascot? Oh, okay, so we have,
So this is a friend's car, and I spent some time restoring it. And so it is the perfect vehicle to oversee the hill and take care of.
okay. And again, there's a whole story that goes with this about the man who owned it, Vince Miro, and restoring it. And that could be a program unto itself. And we have some experts with us today that can tell you more about that. So as the program finishes up, it's outside, and we hope that you have your picture taken in front of it. Stand with Joey. Okay, so for the Zoom people, this was a car that was owned by a friend of Joey's, Vince Miro, who lives in Greenfield. Maybe some of you remember Smiro's mobile station on Route 9. Maybe you don't. And Joey worked with him on restoring this vehicle. And then it was eventually given to him by Vince. And he has it out here when there's weddings. And sometimes you take brides out in it. Yes, brides and grooms, of course. And not just brides, that didn't sound good, did it? Yeah. I always, when I was looking online, I noticed the brides always having this as their photo op, and I didn't notice many grooms, but I'm sure they're there. So I hope that you take a photo in front of it as well. So it's a 1927 Buick. Joey, do you want to say anything more about that?
It was Judge Cody's car, and his granddaughter is right here.
Okay, so Judge Cody from.
It was in a barn when we were growing up. And I used to play it.
So it wound up in pieces and boxes, and her dad, Judge Cody, who owned it, gave it to Vince, and then they worked on, how many years did it take you to restore this?
Like 5 years.
5 years, a labor of love. So this spot certainly has shared some very rich history, and if you've seen the Saratoga Opoly game, it is also a square on the Saratoga Monopoly game, Ann's Washington Inn. So it lives on, and I hope it will continue to shape our history for many years to come. So any questions, either from our Zoom people or people in the audience? Patrice.
We always heard it called Dr. Mccarty's Dream Hospital. Did you run into that terminology? And we always thought that the dream came true because he married a wealthy woman from like Troy, whose father had something to do with the collar industry, but that may just be my imagination.
I did not see that. I've never seen it in print. And when you Google it, so for those of you who like to dig into old history, if you go, there's two places that I like to look. One is fultonhistory.com, and it has all the old newspapers scanned, not so much the Saratogian, the early editions, but not all of them. A lot of the Troy newspapers, all of the New York Times, and also newspapers.com. So when you enter in Dr. Mccarty or Mccarty's Hospital, you get all kinds of articles. Probably every time a child is born, it's in there. And then at the time, newspapers were freer with what they'd write. They would write about, there was one front page story about a baby with deformities. It had an extra finger, and it described in detail of Dr. Mccarty removing this finger but leaving the toes, and crazy stories, but I never saw that. I'm not saying that it didn't happen, but it was never called that.
Kind of what we heard.
Okay. Any other questions? Yes.
Can you please tell us about the Vulcan family and their mineral spring from a private.
Okay, so you figured out that that is the lie. So if you chose that one, you were correct. Okay, we will have that drawing in just a minute. So no, but there is a little bit more of a story with that. So that's not so much a lie. And of course, this property is on the fault line where there were many springs. And one of the suits in this, you'll see that sanitarium, strong sanitarium, that the springs were overtapped. So that's when the state came in and they tried to regulate it. And that's when we created the park to have it more regulated. So not just anybody. If you look in the city directories in 1900, it lists all the private springs. They were privately owned and they were tapped and people made a business out of it. So that was taken away. But the Boken family were led to believe that you had a spring here, correct, Joey? Susan?
Yes.
Okay, Dr. Mccarty did.
Lead him to believe that? Did he lead you to believe there was a spring here?
I've heard stories about it, but I could never find it.
Yeah.
You sealed it when you captured
Okay, so they heard stories about it. You even paid, you had a Dowser convention here? There was a Dowser convention and he even paid to have them try to find that spring so they could enjoy it, but they were unable to find anything. So either it was capped over, as many of the springs were. So that is the lie, but it was close. Yeah. So how many of you got that one? How many of you picked the origins of the Temple Sinai? I figured it would be between those two. And yeah,
I have a funny story about that. I went to St. Peter's, as most of us did in our family. And I was in 6th grade and I would help Mr. Pechter put the Torah up and put up the chairs. I love the affiliation of getting to, I had a feeling there was more to life than just the Catholic religion. So of course here I am. So I'm in school and I'm explaining that we have a temple in the front of our hotel. And the nun questions me and I go, do you really think I would make up something like that? So she called my father and of course he said, yes, we do. And I made her explain to the class, the facts. So.
well, thank you very much. Joey has graciously opened up. There are 8 rooms that are open to tour today, so feel free to walk around. Feel free to do a photo op picture. Come on up and grab an article, look further at things. And Susan?
Miss, I was led to believe you had a prize for those who got the answer right.
I do have a prize for those. So
Well, let me do our goodbyes and then we can collect and make an announcement. Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Joe. Buildings tell stories and they keep those stories. And I think that sort of, again, is like why we do what we do, because sometimes when you lose these buildings, you lose the people and the stories that go with them. And we are so fortunate to have so many people and people who've cared and preserved this building and this property to help tell these stories that came before them. So thank you for being wonderful stewards to this. Again, one other thing I didn't mention, if anybody's always gone down North Broadway and wondered about what the Masonic Lodge looked like inside, from 10 to 2, we have a rehab in progress tour. And I think it's $15 and $20, but it's sort of interesting to see the history of that building, how it changed over time. So I encourage you to do that. Again, the virtual tour, you can learn more about the Brackett House, and Senator Brackett was Spencer Trask is the one that did the legislation to protect our spring waters, and hence the Spirit of Life is to represent him and his work. And last but not least, I want to thank Joe, 5 Points. I want to thank all of our corporate sponsors that we have displayed over here. We couldn't have done this event. This is our largest annual fundraiser. We were not able to hold it last year in person. And to do this hybrid this year was impactful. And the only way we really could have done it is with their help and our the support of our honorary committee members. And while right now our porch party is technically sold out because we had such overwhelming support, we are working on a way to be able to expand that. And so if you have an interest in coming to our porch party the Thursday of before Father's Day, keep checking in with us. But again, thank you for all coming and spending time with us in person because it's so great to see people.